She was called a home wrecker by half the world. She was blamed for the breakdown of the most famous marriage in royal history. The British press hunted her like a fox. The public despised her. And yet somehow, on a quiet spring morning in Windsor, she walked into a church beside the future King of England and became his wife. This is not a fairy tale. This is something far more complicated than that. This is the true story of how Camilla Parker Bowles went from being the most hated woman in Britain to standing just one step away from the throne itself, and the explosive question that haunts the royal family to this day. Did she ever truly earn that place? Or was it simply handed to her by a king who could not say no? There is a photograph that very few people have ever seen. It was taken sometime in the early 1970s at a polo match in Windsor Great Park. In it, a young woman in a floral dress is laughing at something off camera, her hair loose around her shoulders, her expression completely unguarded and joyful. She looks like any ordinary young woman having an ordinary good afternoon. Beside her, looking at her with the kind of attention that is difficult to fake, stands a young man with neat dark hair and the careful posture of someone who has been told since birth to stand straight and look dignified. The man is Charles, Prince of Wales. The woman is Camilla Shand. And in that one photograph, frozen in a moment that neither of them could have fully understood at the time, you can see the beginning of everything that would follow, the love, the scandal, the grief, the long and painful journey that would eventually end not in disaster, but in a crown. But to understand how things ended, you first need to understand how they began. And to understand how they began, you need to go back even further, to a Britain that was very different from the one we know today, to a royal family that operated by rules so rigid and unforgiving that they could break the strongest people, and to a young prince who was, despite all his privilege and his position, deeply and genuinely lonely. Charles Philip Arthur George was born on November 14, 1948, the first child of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. His birth was celebrated across the entire Commonwealth. Church bells rang. Bonfires were lit. The press called him the most important baby born in Britain since the war. And from the very first day of his life, the weight of expectation was placed on his small shoulders like a stone he would never be allowed to put down. His mother would become queen before he was 4 years old. His childhood was not, by any ordinary measure, a warm one. Queen Elizabeth II loved her son, of that there is no real doubt. But she was a woman shaped by duty above everything else, and duty does not always leave room for softness. Charles was sent to boarding school at a young age, following his father's insistence. He was not a natural fit for the rough and physical culture of Gordonstoun in Scotland, where Philip had also studied. He was sensitive, artistic, interested in music and painting and poetry, and the school's hard outdoor lifestyle was not a match for who he was. He was bullied, he was cold, he was unhappy. He wrote letters home that spoke of loneliness in ways that would have made any mother's heart break. And Elizabeth, whatever her private feelings, was not in a position to simply pull him out and bring him back to the palace. The monarchy had an image to maintain. The heir to the throne had a character to build. And so Charles stayed, and he endured, and somewhere in all of that endurance, he developed a longing for warmth and intimacy that would define the rest of his life. By the time he was in his early 20s, Charles was a young man who had been told very clearly what was expected of him but had been given very little guidance on how to actually find it. He needed, his family and advisors agreed, a suitable wife. The word suitable carried enormous weight in the royal context. A suitable wife was someone who was aristocratic but not foreign, who was Protestant, who had an unblemished personal history, who understood the demands of royal life, and who, perhaps most importantly, had never had a serious romantic relationship before. The logic behind that last point was both old-fashioned and ruthless. The future Queen of England could not come with a complicated past. She would be scrutinized by the entire world, and anything in her history that the press could use against her would be used. Charles was expected, essentially, to find and marry a woman who had been waiting, quietly and perfectly, for him to appear. Camilla Shand was not that woman. She was funny, confident, outspoken, and utterly comfortable in her own skin in a way that Charles found completely intoxicating. She came from an aristocratic family. Her great-grandmother Alice Capel had famously been the mistress of King Edward VII, and there was an ease and a lack of pretension about her that was refreshingly unlike the carefully managed formality Charles encountered everywhere else in his life. They met in 1971 at a polo match, and the attraction between them was immediate. Camilla, with characteristic directness, reportedly said to him something along the lines of, "My great-grandmother was your great-great-grandfather's mistress." How about it? The line, whether exactly accurate or slightly polished by time and retelling, captures something true about who Camilla was. Irreverent, unafraid, and completely without the stiff deference that made most of Charles's interactions feel like performances. They fell in love. By most accounts, it was a genuine, deep, and mutual love, the kind that people who were there have consistently described in terms that go well beyond the usual royal courtship language. Charles was, for perhaps the first time in his life, fully himself with someone. Camilla understood him in ways that his public role and his royal obligations never allowed him to be understood. They were happy together in the uncomplicated way that young people in love can be happy before the world, and its complications crash in on them. And then Charles left. In early 1973, he was posted with the Royal Navy to the Caribbean, and while he was away, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, a cavalry officer whom she had known for years. The reasons for that marriage have been analyzed and debated ever since. Some have argued that Camilla genuinely loved Andrew. Others have suggested she grew tired of waiting for Charles to make a commitment. There are those who have said that Charles's advisors made it clear to him that Camilla was not an acceptable choice for a royal wife. She was too free-spirited, too previously romantically active, too much herself to fit the mold of what a future queen was supposed to be. Whatever the exact combination of factors, the result was the same. When Charles returned, Camilla was Mrs. Parker Bowles. She was, in the technical and legal sense, off the table. But the heart, as anyone who has ever been in love knows, does not operate on a technical and legal basis. Charles and Camilla remained close. They saw each other socially, in the overlapping circles of the British aristocracy where it was entirely possible to attend the same dinner parties, the same race meetings, the same country house weekends, without it necessarily being scandalous. Whether their relationship during these years was romantic or simply a deep and enduring friendship is something that has never been entirely settled, and perhaps never will be. What is clear is that the connection between them did not break. It bent under the pressure of their separate lives. It adapted to their circumstances, but it did not break. Meanwhile, Charles was still under enormous pressure to find a wife. The Queen, Prince Philip, and the various advisors and courtiers who orbited the royal family all agreed that the Prince of Wales needed to settle down. He was approaching 30. He had over the years dated a series of women, Davina Sheffield, Lady Jane Wellesley, Anna Wallis, without any of them becoming the one. The press monitored his romantic life with intense and sometimes cruel interest. Every woman he was seen with was immediately evaluated for her suitability, her background, her potential as a future queen. It was, by any measure, an absolutely extraordinary way to try to find a partner. Lady Diana Spencer entered this picture in 1980. She was 19 years old, the daughter of Earl Spencer, shy and sweet and entirely without the kind of complicated history that royal advisors feared. She had never had a serious boyfriend. She was aristocratic, Protestant, and English. On paper, she was perfect. The press adored her immediately. The public fell in love with her before the engagement was even officially announced. She was young and she was beautiful, and she seemed to represent something hopeful, a fresh start, a fairy tale, the beginning of a new and happier chapter for a family that carried the weight of centuries of tradition and expectation. Charles proposed to Diana in February 1981. When a journalist asked them in their engagement interview if they were in love, Diana said yes immediately. Charles paused and then said, in a phrase that would be replayed and analyzed for decades, "Whatever love means." It was an honest answer, which perhaps made it worse. It suggested to anyone paying close attention that the Prince of Wales was not entirely certain of his own feelings. But it was 1981, and the world wanted a fairy tale, and so the moment was noted and then swept past on the tide of excitement that preceded the wedding of the century. The wedding took place on July 29, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. 750 million people watched it on television around the world. Diana wore a dress with a 25-foot train. The streets of London were packed with people waving flags and weeping happy tears. It was, in every visual and ceremonial sense, a triumph. The world believed it was witnessing the beginning of a great love story. What it was actually witnessing was the beginning of one of the most painful and public marital breakdowns in modern history. The marriage struggled almost from the start. Diana was young and unprepared for the isolation of royal life. Charles was emotionally withdrawn in ways she hadn't anticipated. The couple had different temperaments, different needs, and crucially different understandings of what their marriage was supposed to be. Diana wanted a partner. Charles was deeply embedded in a role that left very little room for partnership in any ordinary sense. The palace, with its rigid protocols and its army of courtiers and its vast institutional machinery, was not designed to make anyone's personal life easy. It was designed to maintain the function and image of the monarchy, and everything else, including the feelings of the people inside it, was secondary to that. Camilla was still in Charles's life. That much has never been seriously disputed. The exact timeline of when their relationship became romantic again is something that Charles and Camilla themselves have spoken about carefully and without complete specificity, but the broad outline is clear enough. At some point during the 1980s, they resumed the kind of closeness that went beyond ordinary friendship. Diana knew it. She had known something was wrong almost from the beginning, and as the years passed and her marriage became increasingly unhappy, her awareness of Camilla's place in her husband's emotional life grew from a suspicion into a certainty. In 1992, the author Andrew Morton published a book called Diana, Her True Story. It was extraordinary for a number of reasons, not least because it was based on secret recordings that Diana had made herself, speaking frankly and in detail about her marriage, her mental health struggles, her feelings of isolation and betrayal, and her conviction that Charles had never truly given up Camilla. The book was a sensation. It changed everything. The fairy tale was over, openly and officially and without any possibility of pretending otherwise. The public reaction was intense and immediate, and almost all of it fell on one side. Diana's. She was the wronged wife, the young woman who had been failed by her husband and abandoned by an institution that should have protected her. Camilla was the other woman. She was the home wrecker, she was the villain. What followed were years of extraordinary public pressure on everyone involved. In 1993, a private telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla was published in the press, an intimate, sometimes explicit recording that became known as Camillagate. The conversation was mortifying for both of them in different ways, and it confirmed publicly what many people had already suspected privately. The Prince of Wales was in love with someone who was not his wife. The damage to his reputation was severe. His approval ratings collapsed. There were people who argued that he should step aside entirely and allow the crown to pass directly to William. Charles and Diana's marriage ended in legal separation in 1992 and divorce in 1996. Diana retained the title of Princess of Wales but lost the prefix, Her Royal Highness. She became, in the language of the palace, simply Diana, Princess of Wales. It was a demotion that stung, and she said so publicly. A year later, on August 31, 1997, Diana died in a car crash in a tunnel in Paris, pursued by photographers. She was 36 years old. The world grieved in a way that had no precedent in living memory. People placed flowers outside Kensington Palace by the millions. The sense of loss was global and genuine and overwhelming. And Camilla Parker Bowles, who had been at the center of the story for 25 years, was suddenly in a position unlike any she had been in before. The woman she had been compared to unfavorably by the entire world was gone. The grief that followed Diana's death was enormous and raw, and a significant portion of the public anger in those first terrible days was directed at the royal family, including, by extension, at Charles and at Camilla. She did not attend the funeral. She stayed out of sight. There was a real question in those weeks about whether Charles would ever be able to rebuild his public image, and whether Camilla could ever be accepted as part of his life in any open or acknowledged way. The answer to that question would take nearly 8 more years to arrive. It would involve a careful, patient, and meticulously managed campaign to slowly reintroduce Camilla to the public, in photographs first, then in careful public appearances, then in more formal contexts, that was coordinated by palace communications teams with the deliberateness of a military operation. It would involve the softening of public opinion through years of consistency and quiet dignity. It would involve the acceptance, gradual and grudging in some quarters, that Charles was not going to give Camilla up, and that if the British public wanted a king, they were going to have to make some peace with the woman who stood beside him. And it would culminate on April 9, 2005, in a small civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall, followed by a blessing at St. George's Chapel, that made Camilla Parker Bowles the wife of the Prince of Wales. The announcement of the engagement had come just 2 months earlier, and the reaction had been mixed, some warmth, some residual hostility, a great deal of cautious wait-and-see. The Queen did not attend the civil ceremony, citing a scheduling conflict, though she and Prince Philip did attend the blessing. William and Harry were both present. It was not a fairy tale wedding. It was quiet and legal and real. And it was the beginning of the final, most complicated chapter of Camilla's journey, the chapter in which she would have to figure out not just who she was as a wife, but who she was in the eyes of a nation that had spent decades deciding what to think of her. The question of her title had been addressed before the wedding in terms that would prove to be far more complicated than anyone had let on. The official announcement stated that upon Charles's accession to the throne, Camilla would be known as Princess Consort rather than Queen Consort. This was an extraordinary and unprecedented concession, a deliberate step away from the full constitutional implications of her position as the wife of the monarch. It was designed to manage public feeling, to acknowledge that large parts of the British population still associated Camilla with the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage, and to signal that the royal family was aware of and sensitive to those feelings. It was, in its way, a political decision dressed up in the language of personal choice. The decision satisfied some people and puzzled others. Constitutional experts noted that the title of Queen Consort was not simply an honor. It was the automatic legal consequence of being married to the king. The idea of voluntarily declining it was without real precedent. But the palace had stated its intention clearly, and for several years, that statement stood as the settled understanding of what would happen when the time came. Except that things did not remain settled, and the next chapter of Camilla's story, the chapter that would involve a reversal of that initial promise, the granting of titles that had once been withheld, and the profound and ongoing question of whether any of it could ever fully heal what had been broken, was still to come. There is a moment that people who were paying close attention to British royal history remember very clearly. It happened in January 1999, more than a year after Diana's death, when Charles and Camilla were photographed together for the first time as a couple, walking out of a party at the Ritz Hotel in London. It was not accidental. Nothing about that photograph was accidental. The location had been chosen. The timing had been coordinated with palace communications staff. The photographers who captured the image were not there by chance. It was understood by everyone involved that this was a managed moment, a deliberate and carefully calibrated step in a long and complicated public rehabilitation. In the photograph, Charles and Camilla are walking side by side, and Camilla is smiling. It is not a nervous smile or an uncertain one. It is the smile of a woman who knows exactly where she is and has decided, after years of hiding and years of being someone's secret, that she is done with all of that. The reaction to that photograph was not warm. It was not hostile in the way that the worst days of the 1990s had been hostile, when newspapers ran photographs of Camilla with headlines that were openly cruel, and when she could not appear anywhere in public without being booed. But it was not warm either. It was cautious and suspicious, and laced with the particular kind of British grudgingness that is not quite opposition, but is not quite acceptance either. People looked at that image and they thought of Diana, and that was the problem that no amount of careful media management could entirely solve. Because Diana was not just gone. Diana was, in the collective imagination of an enormous portion of the British public, a saint. She had died young and beautiful and wronged, and the story that had crystallized around her in the years since her death had hardened into something almost mythological. Camilla was the villain of that myth, and myths are very hard to rewrite. What followed over the next 6 years was one of the most deliberate image rehabilitation campaigns in the history of the British monarchy. It was not cynical, exactly. The people involved, including Charles himself, would argue that they were simply doing what was necessary to allow the heir to the throne to live his life, honestly rather than in the secretive and ultimately destructive way of the previous decade. But it was calculated, and it was patient, and it was managed with a professionalism that acknowledged, clearly and without sentiment, that the British public needed to be brought along slowly rather than confronted with change all at once. The strategy operated on several levels simultaneously. On the most basic level, it was about visibility, making sure that Camilla was seen, regularly and in normal-seeming contexts, so that the fact of her existence in Charles's life became familiar rather than shocking. Familiarity is one of the most powerful tools in the management of public opinion. people can be outraged by what they are not used to. They have a much harder time maintaining sustained outrage about something they see every week, unremarkably, in the newspapers. So Camilla began to appear, first at small private events, then at slightly larger ones, then at events with some minor official character. Each step was taken slowly. Each one was evaluated for the public response it generated, and each one, over time, generated a slightly less hostile and slightly more accepting response than the one before it. On a second level, the strategy was about Camilla herself and how she presented. She was not, by nature, someone who courted public attention. She was deeply private in ways that ran counter to the usual instincts of someone who needed the public to like them. But she adapted. She appeared at charity events. She spoke simply and without artifice when she was quoted in the press. She did not attempt to compete with the memory of Diana on Diana's terms. She did not try to be glamorous or to be beloved in the way Diana had been beloved. She was warm and down-to-earth, and slightly self-deprecating in a very specifically English way, and she let those qualities speak for themselves rather than amplifying them through the usual mechanisms of celebrity image management. It worked slowly, in the way that honest things sometimes work slowly, but eventually work. On a third level, and perhaps most importantly, the strategy depended on time. Time was the one thing that the palace and Charles and Camilla all understood they needed and could not manufacture. Diana had died in 1997. The grief was real, and it was enormous, and it needed to move through its natural stages before any other narrative could take hold. There was nothing to be done about that except to wait, and to be consistent during the waiting, and to not make any mistakes that would hand the hostile press a reason to restart the cycle of outrage. They made very few mistakes. There were moments, a comment here, a photographed expression there, that generated brief storms of negative coverage. But the broad trajectory of those years between 1997 and 2005 was one of gradual, undramatic, and remarkably steady progress. By the time the engagement was announced in February 2005, the British public's response was different from what it would have been even 5 years earlier. It was not enthusiastic. It was not the kind of joy that had greeted the announcement of Charles and Diana's engagement in 1981. But it was not the vicious opposition that many people had predicted. The most common public response seemed to be something like resigned acceptance, an acknowledgement that this was going to happen, that it was probably the right thing for Charles personally, and that the nation might as well make some peace with it. Queen Elizabeth II's response to the engagement was characteristically measured. She issued a statement expressing her pleasure at the news. She was, by this point, at a private and personal level, genuinely supportive of the relationship. She had seen what the secrecy and the misery of the 1980s and 1990s had done to her son, and she was not an unfeeling woman, whatever her public image suggested. But she was also the queen, and she understood that her public endorsement of the marriage carried weight that went well beyond the personal. Her statement was warm but not effusive. It was the kind of carefully worded approval that said yes, without saying it quite loudly enough to be seen, as demanding that everyone else say it too. The wedding itself, when it came, was low-key by royal standards. There were no open carriages, no cathedral crowds, no global television audiences in the hundreds of millions. It was a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall, followed by a blessing at St. George's Chapel, attended by a relatively small group of family and close friends. William and Harry were both there. William, who had always maintained a relationship with Camilla that was civil if not always emotionally uncomplicated, appeared composed and supportive. Harry, who was 18 at the time and whose feelings about the marriage were considerably more complicated, also attended and also conducted himself publicly with a dignity that was noted and appreciated. It was not a day of great joy in the public imagination, but neither was it the disaster that some had predicted. It passed, and the world moved on, and Charles and Camilla were married. What came next was the question of what, exactly, Camilla would be called. The title question had been addressed in the pre-wedding announcement with language that was designed to minimize controversy. Camilla would be known as the Duchess of Cornwall, using Charles's secondary title as the basis for her own. When Charles became king, she would be known as Princess Consort rather than Queen Consort. This was, as mentioned, constitutionally unusual. The Queen Consort title is not just a courtesy. It is the legal consequence of marriage to a reigning monarch. To say that Camilla would use a different title was to say, in effect, that the royal family was making a deliberate exception to constitutional practice in order to manage public sentiment. It was, depending on your perspective, either a sensitive and thoughtful acknowledgement of public feeling or an extraordinary accommodation to the lingering memory of a woman who had been dead for 8 years. For several years, that statement of intent held. Camilla was the Duchess of Cornwall. She carried out increasing numbers of royal engagements. She appeared alongside Charles at official events, at state visits, at overseas tour. She was, in practical terms, doing the work of a senior royal. The public's response to her continued to evolve. Opinion polls from the mid-2000s showed significant improvement in her personal approval ratings compared to where they had been in the 1990s. She was not beloved. She was not, and probably never would be beloved in the way Diana had been beloved. But she was accepted, which was something, and the acceptance was growing. Charles's position in the public imagination was also evolving during these years, and not always in ways that helped Camilla. He was a complicated figure, brilliant in some ways, eccentric in others, deeply committed to causes like organic farming and architectural conservation and environmental protection that sometimes attracted ridicule before they became mainstream. He was not a natural media personality. He did not have Diana's instinctive connection with people, her ability to make whoever she was speaking to feel as if they were the only person in the room. But he was consistent, and he was genuine, and he was, over the years, doing the work of the heir to the throne with a seriousness and a dedication that even his harshest critics found difficult to dismiss entirely. The relationship between William and Camilla was one of the more closely watched subplots of these years. William had adored his mother. The fact of Camilla's role in the breakdown of his parents' marriage was something he had grown up knowing, in the way that children who are caught between warring parents grow up knowing things that no child should have to carry. And yet he had over time developed what appeared to be a genuinely workable relationship with the woman his father had married. He called her Camilla rather than any maternal title. She did not attempt to position herself as a stepmother in any formal sense. The understanding between them was adult and realistic. She was his father's wife, he was his father's son, and they would find a way to coexist that acknowledged those facts without pretending that the history behind them did not exist. Harry's relationship with Camilla was, by most accounts, somewhat warmer in these early years. He was younger, he had been less consciously involved in the details of his parents' marriage and divorce, and he had the kind of resilient, instinctively social temperament that made him better able to take people at face value. He had spent time with Camilla at Highgrove and at Birkhall in Scotland, and by his own later account, found her funny and easy to be around. The public warmth between Harry and Camilla in the years immediately after the marriage was noted by royal observers as a good sign. A sign that the family was managing the new configuration more gracefully than many had expected. What no one knew in those relatively settled years of the mid to late 2000s was that the question of Camilla's title was not, in fact, settled at all. The statement that she would be princess consort rather than queen consort was not a constitutional document. It was a press release. It expressed an intention, but intention can change, and intentions expressed by royal households are sometimes revisited when the circumstances that prompted them have themselves changed. Queen Elizabeth II was still on the throne. Charles was still the Prince of Wales. The moment when any of this would have to be tested against reality was still in the future, still a theoretical concern rather than a practical one. And then, slowly and then all at once, the world that had seemed settled began to shift again. Queen Elizabeth II turned 80 in 2006, then 90 in 2016. The question of the transition, of what would happen when the longest-reigning monarch in British history was no longer there, began to occupy the minds of the people who think professionally about such things: constitutional scholars, royal commentators, palace officials. The question of Camilla's title sat in the middle of those conversations like a small but persistent stone in a shoe. It needed to be resolved, eventually. And when it was resolved, the resolution would tell the world something important about what the royal family, and perhaps the British public, had finally decided about the woman who had waited so long and so patiently to be accepted. The years of William's own growth into royal life added another dimension to the story. His marriage to Catherine Middleton in 2011 was everything that Charles and Camilla's civil ceremony had not been. It was the fairy tale that the public had been waiting to believe in again. It was watched by hundreds of millions. It was celebrated with a joy and a warmth that the royal family had not experienced since the early days of Diana. Catherine was loved immediately and extensively, and her presence in the family was, among other things, a signal that the monarchy could still do this, could still produce the kind of romantic narrative that made people feel connected to something larger than themselves. It did not directly affect Camilla's position, but it affected the emotional climate around the royal family in ways that mattered. A family that contained Catherine could, perhaps, also fully contain Camilla. A public that had fallen in love again could, perhaps, also find room in their complicated feelings for the woman they had once despised. The decade between 2012 and 2022 was, in many ways, the decade in which Camilla consolidated her position more definitively than in any previous period. She became a regular and visible presence at official royal events. Her charitable work, she was particularly active in causes related to literacy, domestic violence awareness, and osteoporosis, developed a profile and a respect of its own. She was no longer simply Charles's wife and Diana's successor in the public imagination. She was becoming, gradually and incrementally, a figure in her own right. The coverage of her in the press, while never entirely uncomplicated, shifted significantly toward the respectful and sometimes genuinely warm. Royal correspondents who had spent years writing about the controversy surrounding her began to write about her engagements, her charities, her interactions with the public. And then the moment that changed everything, absolutely and finally, arrived. In February 2022, in a statement released as part of her Platinum Jubilee, celebrating 70 years on the throne, Queen Elizabeth II expressed in unmistakable terms her wish that when the time came, Camilla should be known as Queen Consort. It was not a throwaway line. It was a deliberate, carefully considered statement placed in a significant document, designed to be read as a clear and unambiguous royal endorsement. The Queen was not merely expressing a preference. She was, as effectively as she could without being the person with the authority to make the final decision, removing the question from the table. She was saying, when my son becomes king, his wife will be queen. That is what I want. That is what I believe is right. The reaction to that statement was, by this point, considerably different from what it would have been 10 or 15 or 20 years earlier. There was some residual opposition. There always would be, among those whose feelings about Diana remained raw and whose sense of what was owed to her memory had not softened with the years. But the predominant response was one of acknowledgement and acceptance. Camilla herself responded to the statement publicly with an expression of humility and gratitude that struck most observers as genuine. She had not sought the title, she said. She was grateful for the faith it represented. She would try to be worthy of it. It was a long way from the photograph at the Ritz in 1999. It was a long way from the vicious headlines and the booed public appearances and the years of hiding. It was a long way from the woman who had spent decades being defined entirely by her role in someone else's story. But the final chapter, the one that would determine whether all of this had truly changed anything, or whether the weight of history was simply too great to be lifted, had not yet been written. That chapter would begin on the day Queen Elizabeth II died, and its implications would be felt in ways that no one had fully anticipated. On September 8, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. She was 96 years old, and she had reigned for 70 years and 214 days, longer than any other monarch in British history. The announcement came in the early evening, and the response across Britain and around the world was one of the most profound collective moments of grief in living memory. People gathered outside Buckingham Palace in the thousands. The flags came down to half-mast. The BBC abandoned its regular programming and broadcasters sat solemnly in dark suits and spoke in quiet voices about a woman who had been a constant in the lives of everyone alive in the United Kingdom. There was a sense, shared even by people who were not particular royalists, that something enormous and irreplaceable had left the world. In the hours after the Queen's death was announced, a statement was issued that contained a single line of consequence for the story we have been telling throughout this documentary. The statement confirmed that Charles was now king, and that Camilla was now queen consort. There was no equivocation, no reference to the old promise of a princess consort title, no qualification of any kind. The title that the palace had once said she would not hold was now hers. The statement reflected the Queen's expressed wishes from her Platinum Jubilee message in February of that year, and it was presented as the fulfillment of those wishes, rather than as any kind of reversal or contradiction. for people who had been paying close attention to the royal family for years, and there are many such people in Britain. It was both of those things at once. It was the fulfillment of the late Queen's final stated wish on the matter, and it was a reversal of what had been promised at the time of the 2005 wedding. The two things could both be true simultaneously, and they were. The world had changed. Public opinion had changed. The royal family's assessment of what the public would accept had changed. And Camilla, who had spent 5 decades navigating a position that no protocol or precedent had really been designed to accommodate, had arrived at the endpoint that most observers, if they were honest with themselves, had probably always expected she would eventually reach. The coronation of King Charles III took place on May 6, 2023, at Westminster Abbey. It was the first coronation in 70 years. The ceremony combined centuries-old tradition with elements that had been updated for the modern age, including more diverse religious participation and modified oaths. And at its center, wearing a crown that had been specifically designed for her, the Queen Mary crown, refurbished and reset, was Camilla, Queen Consort. She was crowned in a separate ceremony immediately following Charles's own coronation, in keeping with the ancient rite. She wore a dress of white satin and gold embroidery. She was 75 years old. And as the Archbishop of Canterbury placed the crown on her head, and the congregation in Westminster Abbey cried, "God save the Queen." The story that had begun with a polo match in Windsor Great Park more than 50 years earlier arrived at a destination that no one standing at that starting point could possibly have imagined. The public response to the coronation, and to Camilla's presence at it, was considerably more nuanced than either her most fervent supporters or her most persistent critics would have wanted. The crowds outside Westminster Abbey were large and enthusiastic, though they were also notably smaller than the crowds that had gathered for Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953 or for Diana's wedding in 1981. The television audience was substantial. And in the coverage that followed, a theme emerged that was different from what had characterized the coverage of Camilla for most of the previous 3 decades. Respect. Not love. Not the uncomplicated adoration that the British public had poured on Diana or that they were beginning to pour on Catherine, but respect, offered seriously and without irony for a woman who had survived something that might have destroyed a person with a less resilient sense of self. There were, of course, those who could not manage even respect. There were people, and not a small number of them, for whom Camilla's coronation as Queen Consort was a wound, a formal institutional endorsement of the person they held responsible for breaking up a marriage, and in some indirect but emotionally powerful sense, for contributing to the circumstances that had led to Diana's death. These people did not disappear when Charles became king. They did not change their minds because a ceremony was held and an ancient crown was placed on an elderly woman's head. They were there before, and they were there after, and they continued to express their feelings through the usual channels of social media and letters to newspapers, and the particular kind of British muttering that is not quite public complaint, but is emphatically not private either. William and Catherine's response to the new order was publicly entirely correct. They stood at the coronation as the Prince and Princess of Wales, the future King and Queen of Britain, and they conducted themselves with the composure and the public grace that had become their particular royal gift. William had accepted Camilla as his father's wife for 18 years. He had worked alongside her at royal engagements. He had, over time, arrived at what appeared to be a genuine and functional relationship with her. None of that meant the complexities of his feelings had been resolved entirely. How could they have been, given the history? But it meant they had been managed, in the specifically royal way of managing things that are too large and too painful to ever be fully resolved. Harry's position was entirely different. By the time of the coronation, Harry had left the royal family. He had stepped back from senior royal duties in January 2020, alongside his wife Meghan Markle, and had moved to the United States. He had given interviews, including a 2-hour special with Oprah Winfrey, in which he and Meghan had spoken extensively about their experiences within the royal family. He had published a memoir, Spare, released in January 2023, 4 months before the coronation, in which he described the internal world of the royal family in ways that were unprecedented in their candor and in their specificity. The book contained passages about Camilla that were among the most striking in the entire memoir, not because they were cruel exactly, but because they were clear-eyed in a way that the official royal narrative never was. Harry wrote about Camilla in terms that acknowledged her charm and her humor, but also raised pointed questions about her relationship with the tabloid press and what he characterized as a willingness, on her part, to use that relationship in ways that were not always in the best interests of the people around her. Those passages were controversial, and the response to them illustrated the degree to which Camilla had, by 2023, genuinely changed her position in the public imagination. 10 years earlier, the suggestion that Camilla might be manipulative or self-serving would have been received as confirmation of what many people had always believed about her. In 2023, it was received, by much of the press and much of the public, as an unfair attack on a woman who had worked hard to serve the institution and had earned her position through decades of patience and effort. The shift was real. The sympathy had moved. Camilla was no longer the villain of the story in the way she once had been. The villain now, in the eyes of a significant portion of the British press at least, was Harry. The irony of that reversal was not lost on people who had been following the story for long enough to remember what the headlines had said about Camilla in the 1990s. Harry attended the coronation. He flew from California with his team, but without Meghan. He sat several rows back from the front, away from the immediate family grouping, in a position that said everything that needed to be said about where he now stood in relation to the institution he had left. He did not speak publicly about the coronation or about Camilla's role in it. He returned to California afterward, and the distance, geographic and emotional, between him and his father and his brother continued to be what it had been, wide and painful, and without any obvious path toward resolution. As Queen Consort, Camilla has continued the charitable work that had defined the later years of her time as Duchess of Cornwall. Her focus on domestic violence and abuse prevention, in particular, has drawn consistent praise from advocacy organizations and from survivors themselves. She has spoken about these issues with a directness and a lack of performative sentimentality that has made her engagement with them feel genuine rather than merely ceremonial. Her literacy advocacy has continued through the Reading Room Initiative and her work with the Booker Prize, and she has used her public platform to talk about books and reading in ways that have endeared her to a literary community that is not always instinctively sympathetic to the monarchy. She has, in other words, used the position that was so long and so controversially given to her to do the kinds of things that make a case for that position having been worth fighting for. The question that hangs over all of this, and that no amount of charitable work or public service can entirely resolve, is the question of what we actually believe about the nature of responsibility and redemption. Camilla did not create the conditions that made her and Charles's relationship so damaging to so many people. She did not design the royal system that refused to let Charles marry her in 1973. She did not force him to marry Diana. She did not manufacture the unhappiness of the decade that followed. But she was present in all of it, and her presence had consequences for people who did not choose those consequences and could not avoid them. Diana did not choose to be the wife of a man who was in love with someone else. William and Harry did not choose to grow up in a family shaped by that particular combination of love and obligation and secrecy. The consequences of choices made in the early 1970s rippled outward in ways that touched many lives beyond the two people making them. And yet the opposite argument is also available and also serious. Camilla was a young woman who fell in love with a young man who, by his own account, and by the account of many people who knew him, was the great love of her life. She was denied him by a system she did not create. She made the best life she could in the circumstances she was given. She endured decades of public hatred with a dignity that was, by any measure, extraordinary. She did not break. She did not lash out. She did not give interviews designed to wound. She waited and she worked and she proved herself in ways that went well beyond what the skeptics had ever been willing to grant her. There is something in that story that is not without its own kind of nobility. The truth, as it usually is in real human stories, is somewhere between these two versions. Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen Camilla, is neither the simple villain that the tabloid press constructed in the 1990s, nor the simple heroine that some of her more ardent defenders would now have us believe. She is a human being who made choices and lived with their consequences, who loved a man and ultimately got to be with him, who paid a price for that in public that most people would have found intolerable, and who emerged from all of it in a position that no one at the beginning of the story could have predicted. Her story is interesting not because it is a fairy tale, but because it is explicitly the opposite of one. because it is messy and complicated and resistant to the clean narratives that the public and the press both prefer to the uncomfortable texture of actual lives. King Charles III and Queen Camilla carry out their duties in a Britain that is genuinely and significantly different from the one in which their story began. The monarchy they represent is more questioned, more scrutinized, more openly debated than it was in Elizabeth II's time. The institution that once seemed immovable and permanent has shown itself, in recent years, to be more fragile than anyone had assumed, susceptible to the same forces of cultural change and public questioning that have reshaped every other major institution in British life. Whether the monarchy survives the 21st century in anything like its current form is a question that serious people debate with genuine uncertainty. And the story of Charles and Camilla sits at the center of that uncertainty in ways that are not incidental. They are the generation of royals who exposed, more vividly than any before them, the gap between the fairy tale the monarchy presents and the human reality it contains. In early 2024, King Charles III was diagnosed with cancer. He was 75 years old. The diagnosis was announced publicly, which was a significant departure from the traditional royal practice of extreme medical privacy, a departure that Charles himself apparently wanted, in the belief that being open about his illness was the right thing to do both personally and institutionally. The announcement prompted another wave of public sympathy that, interestingly and perhaps revealingly, extended to Camilla as much as to Charles. She was his wife. She was at his side. And a public that had once held her responsible for so much pain now looked at her supporting her husband through a health crisis and saw, without complication or irony, a wife standing by her husband. The distance traveled between those two versions of public feeling, the version that saw her as a home wrecker and the version that saw her as a devoted companion, is almost impossible to fully measure. But it is real, and it is enormous, and it says something important about the capacity of time and consistency to change the way people see a story. The title that Camilla holds, Queen Consort, is, at its most basic level, a word. It is the designation given to the wife of a reigning monarch. It carries weight and history and constitutional significance, but it is ultimately a word, and words cannot fully capture what it has meant for one woman to spend half a century becoming, in stages and against enormous resistance, the person that word now describes. What Camilla's story captures is something that is, in its way, as genuinely British as the monarchy itself. The idea that acceptance, real and settled acceptance, cannot be granted by proclamation or demanded by authority. It has to be earned, slowly and without guarantees, in the ordinary daily accumulation of who you prove yourself to be. She waited, she worked, she endured. And when the crown came, after everything, after all the years and all the headlines and all the grief and all the distance she had to travel, it came not because it was simply her right as a wife, but because the woman who wore it had made it, over decades of patience and quiet dignity, impossible to argue against. Whether that is enough for everyone who remembers what came before is a question that history will not quickly settle. But the crown is on her head. The story, in that sense, is told. And all the complicated, painful, genuinely human truth of it is now part of the permanent record of one of the most extraordinary royal journeys in modern British history.